Hi everyone. From the previous videos, we have already gone through the doctrine of divine simplicity and impassibility, and we saw how they relate to God's attributes of eternity and immutability. Well, today in this video, we are going to take a quick look at this case study to answer the question of whether is God eternally merciful, or did he only become merciful after sin entered the world? I remember that a few years ago, there was a theological discussion in my church group, whereby one of my friends said that God was not actually eternally merciful. According to him, the fall of Adam has caused God to become merciful. And I was telling him, no, that's not true. If we understand God's divine simplicity and immutability properly, then surely that can't be the case. And I was being pushed back by others that I'm not answering this question using the Bible, and I was just quoting a bunch of theologians. Well, I hope that from the previous videos, I have made clear how we can get divine simplicity from the Bible. And now, to answer this question, as I hinted before, yes, God is eternally merciful, even before sin enters the world. The presence of sin didn't change God. Well, why? That is because if God became merciful, that means there's a difference in his being before and after sin enters the world, which implies a change in him. And this contradicts the doctrine of divine immutability. So if we want to say that God has changed, then we must be ready to let go of God's immutability and to hold the framework of theistic mutualism. But that will also take away God's aseity, impassibility, eternity, and so on, which we will see in our next video. Secondly, if God became merciful after the fall, that means God has acquired a new attribute, thereby making him a composite instead of a simple being. And God is no longer aseity, for he depends on the fall to be merciful. Here, we see that to say God changed means that we must give up simplicity and aseity. Finally, it is not our actions that make us who we are. We are not sinners because of our first sin. We are sinners because it is our nature to sin. Likewise, God is eternally merciful even if there are no avenues for him to act mercifully in a hypothetical world free of sin. To summarize this final answer, we see that God is who he is because that is contingent on his eternal and unchanging nature. So what actually changes when God acts? Well, the change is not in God. The change is actually in creatures and in their relationship with God. We need to note that all of God's economic acts are strictly eternal and they terminate in time on his creation. For example, is God creator before he creates the world? The answer is yes. Because of God's immutability, God has to be the eternal creator, even before the world comes into being. So how do we explain that? Well, we can explain using this diagram. Here we look at God's eternity, and all of these are the acts of God, like how God called the world to come into existence. God calls Abraham, God sends Jesus for the incarnation, and God will one day raise the dead. So all of these are God's acts in history, in the economy, and whatever that God does in the economy, all of them has their beginning in God's eternity. We can trace all of God's economic acts back to his eternity. And God's eternity has no beginning, no succession, or no change. So all of God's work in this world has proceeded from his eternity. And they are manifested at different points of time in the history of the world. So can we say that God is eternally a creator before he creates the world? Yes, because the act of creation must come from God's eternity in the first place. Right? And that preserves God's eternity and his immutability. Hence, we can say that God is the eternal creator. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching.